Several of our subscribers have asked the question, what is the difference between gouache and watercolor? Well, I'll show you. Probably one of the reasons that gouache and watercolor are confused is that they do have some similarities. One of the similarities is they are both a kind of watercolor, but gouache is an opaque watercolor. Regular watercolor is a transparent watercolor. Another way though in which they are similar is that the way they are available to us. Both are available to us in tubes, and both are available to us in cakes. Now in gouache we have available little cake pans like this, and in watercolor we have available little cake pans like this. So we do find though that the cake pans work differently for both media. The other thing that makes them similar is that they have the same binder in them. Both of the mediums are binded with gum arabic. Well, now then let's look at how they're different, because that's what you really wanted to know. One way that they're different is in the way the cake pans work, and I want to address that first, because if you're not already accustomed to working in gouache and you buy a little cake pan like this, you might find it very, very difficult to get good results. Now here, this at one time was the same kind of cake pan as this. As you see, I don't use the cakes, but I did squirt some gouache into little pans here just to show you what happens. When you have the cakes, if you wet them, and you would usually squirt a little bit of water like this onto them, you will find that you just can't get the brilliance, and I'll show you this here. You just can't get the brilliance of color. And I'll put it down right here. Let me just take this away. I'll put it right here. There you go. That is that's more like watercolor, but not like gouache behaves. So why would you buy gouache when you could get watercolor and you're going to get similar results? Well, in watercolor you'll see, I'll show you the comparison between the two in the cake pans, and just wet a little bit here in this one, and you see it's very, very similar. In watercolor you get a very similar thing. Why would you want gouache? Well, the advantage of gouache is that when you get it from the tubes, it can work as an opaque medium and work very much like oil or acrylic, whereas watercolor works more like a transparent medium. Now I'm going to show you, I'm going to put these pans, these cake pans aside and show you the difference. So if we have the gouache, I'll just take my little gouache pan here, and when we're working with gouache, it's a good idea to work with the tubes and to put fresh paint out just before the painting session. It dries very fast. So what I'm going to do here is just put out a couple of colors. I have a phthalo blue here, and so I'll just put a little bit of phthalo blue right here in this little feeding portion of the pan, and then I will put the permanent white. Now right here is another place where watercolor and gouache are different. With watercolor, to get your whites, you simply add more water. To get your lighter colors, you simply add more water. For gouache to be effective, to get your lights, you add white or a lighter color. So I'm just going to add some white here, and then I want to show you the difference between the two. So we'll do gouache first. So with gouache, now I have here two kinds of paper. This is a very smooth paper. This is a hot press watercolor paper. With gouache, you can use hot press watercolor paper, or you can use a good quality heavy duty drawing paper. You can use illustration board. You can use almost any kind of paper that has a smooth surface. So See how it works is that instead of being applied thinly like it is here, gouache works better if you apply it thickly like this. Then to lighten the color, you simply move into the lighter color just like you do if you're working with oil or with acrylic. You simply move into the color and you apply the lighter color. And you can see I can get actually a little gradation of a color here just by continuing to work into it while it's still wet. You see I have here a quality of color that's very similar to the quality I receive, or the surface quality, very similar to what I would receive if I'm working in oil or if I'm working in acrylic. Alright, the opposite of that is in watercolor. Just switch right over here to my watercolor pan. In watercolor, to get that very, very dark, let's see, I'm going to need to wet the watercolor here for you and show you. To get the very, very dark in watercolor, we simply have the ratio of water to paint much less. So we have less water and more paint. Now, if I'm working the watercolor out of the pan, I have here, there's the dark color. Rather than to add white to watercolor, I add a little bit more water and I get the lighter color with more water, like we see here. So you can see there is one of the major differences in the way watercolor and gouache behave. Another thing I might point out to you is that watercolor works beautiful on the cold press watercolor paper. So I can take this is cold press watercolor paper. I can take cold press watercolor paper, and with watercolor I can get a nice smooth wash. See, like this. Just to give you an example. However, if I try to work gouache onto a cold press watercolor paper, it's a little bit more difficult to work. If I'm working, you see what happens here? If I'm working gouache on a cold press, I'm going to have to add a lot more paint in order to cover the surface of the cold press. So one of the differences between gouache and watercolor is that watercolor works well on both cold press and hot press paper. Gouache works best on a smooth paper, not so well on the rougher papers. So those are the major differences. Now, as far as the purpose of watercolor, as you know, is kind of an all-purpose medium. It works really, really well for when you're doing paintings, complete paintings, or when you're doing studies. Some people use gouache for doing complete paintings. There are people that have gouache as their medium for painting. My favorite way to use gouache is to do studies in my sketchbook. The reason it works so well is that gouache dries very fast, so I can have studies in my sketchbook if I want to do studies that are going to point me towards an oil painting. Then I can do gouache studies, and the techniques that I use will be very similar to the same techniques I will use when I'm doing an oil painting. On the other hand, if I do watercolor studies in my sketchbook or on watercolor paper, then that gives me the same feeling of how a watercolor would work if I'm doing a larger watercolor painting. So that gives you some of the differences between gouache and watercolor. They're both wonderful mediums, but they have some uses that are similar and some uses that are different. So if you found this quick tip helpful, why not check out our full-length videos on DianneMize.com. Lots and lots of subjects explored there. And if you have something you'd like for me to explore on the quick tips, leave a comment right down here and I'll be happy to take a look at that. We'll put you on the schedule. And there's your quick tip.